I appreciate everyone coming in. A few weeks ago, I wrote Dr. Paul from the Department of Health and Chief Anderson from our police force and asked them if they would come and give us a brief briefing on the incidence of gun violence in our community. I will readily admit that I did it because I woke up one morning and it seemed a little bit too normal that we were having gun violence in our town. Perhaps I just wasn't paying enough attention, but I felt it was important for the council to respond to at least the perceived increase in gun violence in our town. I've asked the chief and Dr. Paul to spend about 20 minutes going over the basics. I'm then going to call on the chair of 3 of our committees to ask a brief question, and if time allows, we'll do a few other questions. Over the next few weeks, you can anticipate that I'll call on the council to do some other hearings in regards to gun violence. In particular, I've spoken with Councilman O'Connell about having a community meeting in the J.C. Napier community, one of our communities that's highly affected by gun violence, to get input from that community. So that should happen in November. So just keep an eye on your email for that date. With that, I'll turn the floor over to the chief and Dr. Paul. I don't know if y'all are going together as a team or you want one at a time. It's up to y'all. I think both those mics are turned on.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about gun violence. And we're going to just spend a couple of minutes as a warm-up on gun violence as a public health issue in Nashville. And when I talk about public health, it's big picture public health. Public health being everything we do as a community to ensure conditions where people can be safe and can be healthy. So some of this is stuff that the health department will always do. Some of it will be others in partnership. Our mission at the health department is to protect, improve, and sustain the health and well-being of all people in metropolitan Nashville. And our vision is people creating healthy conditions everywhere. I'm going to just touch on the epidemiology and impact of gun violence in Nashville, talk about it as a public health issue, and then just describe some prevention strategies that some of which we're doing, some of which are opportunities potentially. This is a trend in gun violence death rates for Davidson County from 2010 to 2015, and then there's a little dotted line that projects, based on current data for 2016, potentially an increase by the end of the year. You can see that the rate compared in 2014 is higher than the national rate, and that there does seem to be an upward slope in that particular in this particular graph. When you look at these deaths, however, we are looking at all gun violence deaths. Oftentimes people are thinking about homicides exclusively, and when you look at gun violent deaths in Nashville, over half of them are due to suicide. So 50.9% suicide and 46% homicide. Both are vast majority male who are the victims. Suicides tend to occur in older, that is over the age of 30, and the homicides tend to be younger. Both of them take away a lot of years of life, and any death in this manner is something that we want to pay attention to and prevent. Deaths are only part of the picture, though. If you look at hospitalizations, on the left is pretty much the same graph I showed you with the suicides on the left and homicides on the right. 6 times as many people are hospitalized with gun-related injuries, and the colors are a little bit of a challenge here. Suicides are much fewer of them in the hospital. Accidents are a bigger proportion of the hospitalized cases, and then assaults are still a huge, significant part of the hospitalizations. And this goes on to disability, goes on to cost. Is it a public health issue? Well, these are some criteria we use for determining whether this is something we want to act together to prevent. Well, is it preventable? Does it occur frequently? Does it have a high cost? Is there a burden on society? Can it affect entire populations? And does it take action by us as a community to solve? And I would say the answer is yes. When we take a public health approach, one thing we want to be doing is measuring and doing good surveillance and data. In the health department, we typically get data not in real time, and we have not done a lot of detailed analysis looking at violent deaths. Then analyzing data, identifying risk factors, developing and evaluating interventions, and then institutionalizing successful prevention strategies. CDC looks at all of the evidence out there and makes recommendations through a process called the Community Preventive Services Task Force, or the Community Guide. And here are some things that would impact or potentially impact the deaths from gun violence in Nashville. Improved care for depression, mental health benefits. There are a lot of people out there who are uninsured, suffering from depression. Universal school-based violence prevention programs, actually an evidence-based intervention to reduce violent behavior. Therapeutic foster care for chronically delinquent juveniles. CDC has evaluated and recommends against transfer of juveniles to the adult justice system. There's a lot of other things that have been looked at, but not a whole lot of evidence for impact of interventions on gun violence from the public health side of things. What are some things going on in Nashville? Well, there is a lot of activity in terms of a coalition, the Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network. We in the health department have been working on specific suicide prevention projects, including QPR, which is kind of the CPR for people with suicidal ideas. Social and emotional learning is something that MNPS has been scaling up, and I'm not 100% sure whether the violence curriculum is a piece of that. And of course, additional advocacy efforts are going on in the community, and we have some advocates in the audience today. What's needed in terms of resources: collaboration and surveillance, mental health benefits legislation, decreasing and mitigating adverse childhood experiences, because sometimes violence is something that goes from generation to generation, and then really firearm safety education. Those are just some ideas. It's the beginning of a conversation, and I will hand it over to the chief.
Thank you, Mayor Riley, and ladies and gentlemen of the council, for this opportunity to talk about gun violence here in Nashville. A couple of weeks ago, I sent you what we call our density maps that shows where the greatest presence of our police officers. The first page, and there's a handout on your desk. If you didn't see that, I'm sorry. So I have brought you those same maps. This time we've added some demographics to it. But the first page deals with our calls for service. And keep in mind, as we looked at them the last time, the darker the tint, the greater presence of our police officers. And that doesn't mean that in the other areas of Davidson County there's not police officers, but just not in the same concentration. Second page, violent incidents. So that would be homicides, that would be aggravated assaults, including the gunshot wounds, robberies, those particular criminal offenses. Again, the same pattern tends to show where our police officers are, where those events occur. The next page, homicides, again, the same density map that you saw earlier, but with the demographics added. If you'll note that in this 5-year period, 2011 through 2015, there were 278 homicide victims here in Nashville. Gunshot injuries, again, the same time frame, 2011 to 2015, 1,334 gunshot victims. Street robberies, and we differentiate street robberies from our commercial robberies, banks and convenience stores and so forth in one category, and then people just accosted on the street. Street robberies over this just 1 year period, over the 2015 calendar year, 1,649 street robberies. Aggravated assaults, again, 1 calendar year, 4,932. The burglary incidents, same as the map that you saw earlier. And then our vehicle stops, again, showing where that they basically occur. The same map, the same 8 maps are recreated on page 9, showing the patterns of where we are as police officers and then where these events occur. And as we noted earlier, they look strikingly similar. The next pages are graphs that indicate where we are from the year 2001 up through today. Now, as we go through these, we used the first 9 months of 2015 and then projected, and assuming that the events are linear, that we have the same number occurring, this is where we would wind up in 2016. But I do need to note that 2016 is just a projection of what will likely occur over the next 3 months. But you see our incidents, you see our Part 1 crimes are the murders, the homicides, the forcible sexual assaults, robberies, burglaries, auto thefts, and larcenies. As you can see, back in 2001, we were at over 51,000. We had a low in 2014 of 31,352, but you can see that climb back to 32,000 in 2015, and that's what we're projecting for 2016 also. Homicide incidents, historically going back past 2001, we have been as high as 112. In 1997, we had 112. We reached an all-time low in 2014, and that was actually a record low for the history of the metropolitan government since 1963. Our 53-year average homicides is about 76. So you can see that in 2015 we went back to that norm, if you could call it that, of 79. This year to date we have 56, and projecting that out, it appears that we'll have 77 by year's end. Robbery incidents, the same pattern. 2001, we were at the 2,600 mark. We reached a low down in 2014 of 1,500. As you can see, in 2015, we went back to 1,900. Then we're projecting out 1,873 for 2016. Aggravated assaults following a similar pattern. Aggravated assaults with gunshot injuries. As you can see, that remains fairly level. And I should have said, as we go through this, the red line indicates the criminal offenses, the number. The blue line is our population, and you can see from over the years we have grown in population. But the gunshot injuries have remained fairly consistent across the years, but our homicide rate has gone up. And so I think in the back I'll show you a link to an article. It's called to my attention at a meeting last month, actually, with the FBI Director Comey in his office. He asked about 15 of us to come and talk about violent crime across America. And he asked me, he said, why are your shootings, because I was using these same graphs, he said, why are your shootings remaining level but your homicides are going up? Which puzzled me. But a couple of chiefs, including Kevin Davis in Baltimore, pointed out the shootings tend to be more deadly. And there's an article that I've given you a link to there on the back page from the Baltimore area that's talking about people shooting to kill over the last couple of years. And I've talked with our people here and talked with other chiefs, and that seems to be a trend across America. I couldn't help but put in a picture on page 16. I know that we're looking at marijuana and we're looking at decriminalizing to some extent, but we need to keep in mind that the marijuana trade is responsible for a good bit of our violent crimes. Drug dealers robbing each other, only for the money and for the product itself, drug dealers and turf wars with each other. So this picture was taken yesterday, actually, when some of our people took 18 pounds off the out of population, from the population of Nashville, and these were the weapons that were with that stash of marijuana. And on the back page, there are several links to several articles. You hear from time to time that it's the gun laws that's causing the gun violence, and that is true to some extent. There's an article there about what's been called the Charleston loophole. It's called that because Dylan Roof was able to buy a gun and shoot those people in the church in Charleston because the FBI didn't reply to the inquiry from the gun dealer within 3 days. Within 3 days, the gun dealer can go ahead and sell the gun. So that accounts for some of the guns that get on the street. Most of the guns that get on the street are taken from people's automobiles or their homes. We're looking at our data. Chattanooga just sent me some data wherein the theft of guns from automobiles has gone up by about 40%. And that's since the legislature put into effect the laws that allows you to have the guns in the cars. So we're looking at that here in Nashville. The Baltimore article from the Baltimore Sun is in there. Several other articles, and if you choose to look at any of those and you want to talk with me later about the content of that article tonight or at any time in the future, I'd be happy to talk with you. Mr. Mayor, if I could have just a moment of personal privilege. We had scheduled our Collegiate Police Academy, the opening ceremony, so to speak. But this came along, and I didn't want to miss this opportunity. And as hard as I've tried over the years, I've never mastered the ability to be in two places at one time. So I asked them to come here. I thought it would be a good part of their education as we go forward. These are students from Tennessee State. Stand up, if you will, back there. These are students from Tennessee State University. This is our second class, and to my knowledge, this is the only collegiate. Everybody has a citizen police academy, but to my knowledge, this department is the only department that has a collegiate police academy. And I credit Pastor Stevenson. Are you back there, Mr. Frank Stevenson? There you are, sir. Pastor Stevenson has a church over here in the University Court area, and he does wonders over there. And he and Reverend Fuzz came to me one day with this idea and asked me, would we do it? And I was very polite to listen to him. About the first sentence, I was going to answer yes. But I was very polite to listen to the whole presentation before I said yes. So it's been quite successful, and this is the opening night for this class, and we hope that they will be our future police officers for Tennessee State University. But thank you for that moment. And with that, I'd be pleased.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chief.
Pleased to take any questions.
Councilman Pardue.
Chief, of course, I didn't know they was going to be here tonight, but would it not be a good idea that we get these kids even younger than that age of high school?
Well, see, I'm thinking 6 or 8 years old. If we look, as you have a chance to study these maps and see what's going on, I think you'll see that our kids in the inner city area that do not have the opportunities that maybe you and I had, and with no hope, no future, what does that lead to? So everybody in this room had somebody in their life that pushed them forward, that gave them some hope, that created expectations, made them want to live up to those expectations. And so that's where we need to begin with those kids. When we have people on the street that don't have anybody in their life that's a role model, that's where we've got to step in. So thank you for bringing that up. You'll hear me preach about that a lot.
And you should. I agree that the inner city is a lot larger problem, but we still have children from all over the county that comes up with these kind of problems. You know, you're getting bused from school to school and stuff like that. I was raised in a housing project, as you know. back then, this wasn't, kids killing each other wasn't a problem back when I was a kid.
We fought it out.
That's right. But it just it tears my heart out when you see these kids, 12 and 15 years old, shooting each other down. And it's never just I got mad at him and shot him. A lot of them is so damn vicious, where they're shooting each other 5 and 10 times. I don't understand this. I'm not a psychiatrist. I wished I could give you the answer to the problems, and that's what I'm asking you for tonight. Do you know of anything that'll help it?
And when we look at the maps, just because it's not the darker tinted areas, it doesn't mean that there's not issues, as you're speaking of, all over Davidson County that we need to address. And I think that as we go forward, we've got to take into account, and I've told this story 100 times, but Anthony Carter, who's the assistant chief at Tennessee State University, when he was our North Precinct commander, ran a day camp for those kids. And after a few days, the kids get comfortable and they talk and they sort of open up. So a kid comes up to Anthony and he says, "Mr. Carter, how do I get out to the rest of the world?" So what is the rest of the world? Well, that's the world that you and I live in. So here's a kid that lives in Nashville, knows there's another world out there, sees it on TV, sees the cars go by, but doesn't have that thought process of how that he or she can be a part of the world. So that's where we need to begin. And I see it all over Nashville, that kids that get the right opportunity and the right influence in their life become one of us. But otherwise, they sort of get left behind, and then all they know is some violence on the street.
Right. And I Chief, appreciate you being here. I wished I could ask more intelligent questions about this problem. I wished all of us could, and I wish that we could all together have just one answer.
And I certainly appreciate you answering the question, and I wish I was qualified enough to talk more about the answer than the question. And police work has turned into more psychology and sociology than actually crime fighting, and so that's where we all need to be.
Council Lady Gilmore.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Also, thank you for holding this special meeting. It's very progressive of you. I appreciate it. And I want to thank the Chief and Dr. Paul for both being here. And I wanted to ask the both of them, is there anything in the way that they're going to do? I think the Chief spoke to it a little bit, that we know that crime has to do with poverty. And we know that the article that was done in the New York Times showed that Nashville was listed as one of the cities, as you stated, that there was an increase in homicides, but it also showed that there was an increase in poverty. So my question is, do the two of you plan to go out into different parts of the city and do some listening tours and see how best you can work with the citizens from both, not just a policing standpoint, but as you're doing as the impact upon health and disparities and policing and safety?
Well, certainly we're listening every day. We have 646 neighborhood groups across this 533 square miles that we associate ourselves with. And then last year we attended over 2,000 meetings collectively. So we're out there listening every day. One of the things that Mayor Berry has talked about is this 10,000 jobs for our children. And I wish we would think a little bit past the 10,000 jobs and the paycheck that it brings in. And the paycheck's important. But also, and we brought, I'm proud to say, we were the first to hire those interns at the police department. And we had some successes, and we had some that weren't successes, and we'll try again next year. But beyond the paycheck, there's that association with people that are working, that have a productive life, and that influence that flows over, and that guidance. And those talks where that people, those kids are convinced, you can do this. You can be even greater than what we are here. So I hope everybody across Nashville thinks about that as we talk about those jobs. Not just the paycheck, that's important, but beyond that paycheck, that association and that counseling that goes with it.
Mr. Mayor.
Dr. Paul.
Oh,
Okay, sure.
oh, I was going to say yes. Part of what we do in terms of community health improvement is really try to get out there, try to listen to what what our patient, Nashville, cares about, what's important to them. If, I can show you the things that are proven to work somewhere, but it hasn't been proven to work in Nashville until the community's really bought into it and committed itself to it. So I think it's critical for us to understand by listening to community how to approach this issue.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to do a follow-up question, and this is it. I guess I wanted to talk about one as it specifically relates to vulnerable populations and maybe race relations. Most recently when we voted on, and I felt very comfortable for voting for the $1 million for ballistics, but a lot of those communities that feel vulnerable are people of color. They send in a lot of emails and ask why would we do that, knowing what's kind of going on nationally. And I think you have been accredited with the things that you've handled very well here, but I do think we do need to speak to that, because whether it's true or not, we received a lot of emails that asked us why would we support something like that as it relates to race relations and policing. And so I do hope that we can get out in the community, specifically the police, and talk about that with vulnerable populations and people of color. And that's why I asked that question.
Well, I said we're out there every day, and specifically over 2,000 meetings dedicated to that last year.
To race relations?
Well, to community relations in general, and to the quality of life in the communities.
Council Lady Van Rees.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, and I echo the respect that I have for Vice Mayor Briley for bringing us all together. I also wanted to speak to, some of you may be aware, my wife actually works on the National Suicide Prevention Hotline and on the crisis line with Family and Children's Services. And I have, because of that, obviously great respect for the folks on the front line in regard to nearly half of these deaths that happen in Davidson County. I think we need to continue to remind ourselves to take a holistic approach in regard to the situation at hand, and I'm glad that you brought up the opportunities for youth with Opportunity Now and what's happening with that, with the neighborhood opportunities that we have for folks to get together and talk to each other. It's always good. As the chair of the Conventions and Tourism Committee, I wanted to ask specifically in regard to the entertainment district downtown. On behalf of the tourists that come to town, of course, we want to make sure that they feel safe and comfortable, and when they get out of a honky-tonk at 2 a.m. that they can walk down the alley safely, just as much as we want to make sure that anybody living on Dickerson Road can walk down the alley safely, right? So, but specifically in regard to tourism, are there any particular things that are unique to the entertainment district that we need to be made aware of in regard to how you make sure that the community is safe?
No, I think that our downtown area, and that we had the one homicide a couple, 3 weeks ago that everybody knows about, and I think because it was such a rare thing, and that's the reason that we think about it so much. But the downtown area is extremely safe. We have special events. Commander Drake is in the back that commands the Central Precinct, and he's on top of every event that occurs down there. When we have Titans games or Christmas parades or any other thing, the area is flooded with police officers. So it's when I'm down there, I feel safe. I would feel safe with my family walking around without me. In most any area of downtown Nashville.
Councilman Pulley.
Thank you, Mr. President. Briefly to you, I've heard this mentioned twice today. Have you received a promotion that I'm not aware of? I've heard you call Mayor Briley a couple of times.
I think it's just he's hearkening back to an earlier day.
Oh, okay, I got you. Well, kudos to you, and I applaud you for doing this. And I also applaud some of the initiatives coming out of the mayor's office, which will eventually address some of these issues. I think it's important for us, this is something that obviously we don't have a lot of time to deal with today, but hopefully moving forward, we will be able to spend a lot of time on this issue and see what we can do to impact it. I think it's important for us to know that oftentimes the issue isn't really accurately portrayed in the media. We need to drive all our discussions around this issue with data and good, hard, solid data that's not necessarily accurately reflected. To that end, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the data that you've supplied us here today, Chief. And when we look at the, we are talking about gun violence here, so the data you provided relative to robberies and assaults and homicides, those are not all gun violence crimes, are they not?
They are not. The majority would be, but they are not. And we can drill down deeper and look at the means of the homicide or the way that the robbery was accomplished. But the majority are accomplished with a firearm.
Okay, thank you. And secondly, the uniform crime report statistics that you have supplied us with, which help create that the graphs that you put together here, are those based on convictions or are those based on arrests?
Those are based on reports.
And those reports do they deal with convictions or arrests, or do you know?
They do not. If an event is reported to us, it's reported here, whether there's ever an arrest or whether there's ever a conviction.
So this could be either or.
If an aggravated assault, as an example, is reported here, there may be an arrest in the future and there may be a conviction, but we list it even though we might not get an arrest.
So even if it's not an arrest, if it's just a complaint, it'd be listed in the UCR.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I should note too that if you look at and I may have I think I did include it in the links on the back page. The Bureau of Justice Statistics has some data on the unreported crimes, so that we know auto theft is an example. That's reported basically at the 80% level because everybody wants their automobile back or they want their insurance to pay for it. But we know a lot of events aren't reported, so these are incidents reported to us. But certainly there are more that occur in Nashville that are not reported.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Councilman Shulman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Chief, Dr. Paul, just a question on the graphs on the homicide incidents. The 2014 to 2015, that spike, 41 to 79 homicides, which was almost double. And it seems to be tailoring along with the increase in the population. But do we have an understanding of what might have caused that? I mean, it's one of the bigger jumps. I mean, there was a big jump in 2004 to 2005, but that spike, we have any idea what would have caused that?
No, and I have a theory, but that I'm not qualified to have. And I've been asked that question before and studied before. Actually, Director Comey, again, from the FBI, has a theory called the Ferguson effect, and it's his theory that I think we've dissuaded him from now, that police officers sort of took a non-proactive approach. I didn't see that here in Nashville. We follow that data, our officers' proactive work, we monitor it, and I did not see any drop-off. But I coined a phrase called the Ferguson effect, spelled with an A instead of an E. The verb is as opposed to the noun. Mm-hmm. And so I think we saw after Ferguson some unrest across the country. We saw people in the street. We saw people that were there protesting that meant it in their hearts, that brought people out that would not have been in the streets before. And I think that's the reason that we took our approach here in Nashville. We knew these were good people that were expressing their concerns. But I think it also, my theory that I'm not qualified to talk about, is that it also is some sort of social reset, and unleash some violence in some of the areas that the populations that we're talking about earlier that see no hope in their future, that aren't looking beyond tomorrow, that a conviction. We had a gentleman walk into a nightclub 2 or 3 weeks ago. He's about 6'5". He weighs 300 pounds. He's very distinctive. He's known in the nightclub, but he walks in there and shoots 2 people, killing 1. He knows he's going to be identified. So why would he do that except for the fact it doesn't make a lot of difference to him that he might get convicted and be incarcerated? So I think there's all sorts of theories, and again, we're into sociology and psychology as opposed to police work.
Dr. Paul?
One thing to think about, and it's a lot easier to think about at the state level. In fact, the state of Tennessee applied but was not granted this opportunity. But to really kind of drill down, I mean, to really understand short-term trends and long-term trends, one thing that might help is a deeper dive on data. And there is this national program called the National Violent Death Reporting System. And that's kind of a multidisciplinary look at each violent death that tries to understand what the factors might be, from the factors associated with the victim to the care that surrounded the event, all kinds of things like that. Something to think about in terms of assessing short-term and long-term changes in homicide.
And are we looking at that? Is there an effort to study that, to try to figure out what's going on?
The state applied and was not granted the resources to implement that for us this year. Okay. So, I mean, things short of that we could try, but again, it's resource intensive.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Councilor Lady Hurt.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. This is hard for me because I have to articulate properly, and I hope I don't say anything to offend anyone. But some of this seems to be simple to me. You were talking about the homicide rate and why is the homicide higher? When you got bigger guns, you got more homicide. I mean, people are not shooting with 22s anymore. So if you got an AK-7 or whatever the gun is, that's what you're going to have. That's why we had to get money for the ballistic equipment, because you got people with bigger guns, bigger weapons, and all of that. You have, time to time, guns for gas. You have things in the churches where many of the African-American preachers are able to get some of the people to come in and turn in their guns. I believe that if you had more role models that look like the people that are causing these crimes, then you have more effective responsibility and activity from those individuals. The class that you have here, is this the first class that you have?
This is the second collegiate class we've had at Tennessee State University.
What percentage of those that were in the first class were actually hired as police officers or wanted to become?
You know, we have not received any from the first class. Keep in mind, this is not a class to be a police officer. This is similar to the civilian police academies that acquaints them from police work. Some of them haven't graduated yet, and some of them we're still talking to. But again, they'll have to make that leap to us, but we're encouraging it.
So I think if you go as Councilman Pardue said, when you start introducing things to younger people, exposing them to opportunities and influencing them and being intentional and deliberate about what you're doing, I think you can have a greater success rate and influence those kids to want to be. The officers that you have, if you're intentional about giving them supervisor positions or putting them in the positions where other people can see them and see them as role models, then you start seeing the emulation that we need to see in order to do that. You know, the gentleman you talked about, the 6'5" gentleman, he went into that nightclub to kill somebody because he had an issue with that person. And I believe that that's something that you have to deal with. You cannot forget and omit the poverty issue that Councilwoman Gilmore talked about, because that is the root of most of it, and the drugs and all come a part of it. And it has been known many times and for many years in the African-American community anyway, that you want to take a gun from a person, you give them a job. And I think that we really have to focus on that, and we have to be intentional about what we do. And I think we need to have more people of color in the faces of those people committing those crimes.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And as we go forward, I encourage everyone here to encourage anyone you know to apply to be a member of this police department, so that we can consider you. But yes, poverty is a factor, and especially raised in a poverty area, and no one in their life to give them be a role model, to be that guidance. And you're exactly right on all counts. When I was on the streets, the 25 automatic was the standard Saturday night special, and now it's the 9mm and the 40 calibers and actually the assault rifles. So they are a lot more deadly.
Councilman Pridemore, we are going well into your announcement period, but I have 7 other people asking to speak. Without objection, I'll keep going, if that's all right. Councilman Davis, Scott Davis. And I would encourage council members we do have other people who'd like to speak, so get to your question.
Agreeing with my council colleagues, Hurt and Gilmore, and many of you who went before me, but early next year, we're going to start looking at our budget process. And Mr. Cooper, I know you have a yeoman's task in front of you, and I also know the finance department. We're going through this boom right now in our city. So a lot of these nonprofits, other areas, we can use it. We can focus some of that extra funds to those programs that are doing what they're supposed to do, like the Police Academy recruits for Tennessee State University. Mr. Stevenson, Pastor Frank Stevenson, you've been a dear friend of mine over the years. Please come to us during budget season with suggestions. And remind everybody what they saw today, all those positive young men and women here representing that. And more importantly, you know, having more community policing, I've seen it work, and I know my commander is shy, you know, but he's in my community along with his other officers and his COCO at Easter egg hunts, at all kinds of events, you know, be it, you know, a church event or whatnot. And that's helped lower the crime and a lot of the violence in my neighborhood, because when they see that the police officer is just a regular person too, and most time he's out there without his gun, just in his plain clothes with his kids having fun, popping popcorn, you know, with everybody else. And if we can get some more community policing, also, I've seen your efforts to increase men and women of color, you know, in some of the new recruits, and I see that, and I want to tell you I appreciate that, because I've seen your efforts, even though we're not there yet. But a lot of those great programs that don't normally get the metro funding that they deserve, that can make a real difference, council, we need to look at that. And especially, there's a great one in Anthony Davis's district called If Within Full Motion, ran by the Fitzgeralds. I think you secured some funding for them a couple years ago. It's one of the best programs, and it addresses a lot of those young people of color and needs. It's being housed at Stratford. Thank you, Anthony. That's one of the organizations that needs your vote and needs your dollars for this upcoming budget. And I encourage you to help with certain programs like that in Anthony Davis's district.
Councilman Mendez.
If I could, Mr. Mayor.
Sure.
Thank you for talking about the East Precinct Commander, David Emhoff. And what I'm going to ask each commander to do over the next couple of weeks is invite you to their precinct ComStat. We have a ComStat every Friday morning at the North Precinct. And it's all the leadership of the police department talking about everything that's occurred the previous week, what we'll be doing to try to remedy that the next week. It's open to the public, and please come in. But each precinct commander has their own ComStat either on Wednesday or Thursday to talk about everything that's gone on in their precinct so that they can talk about it Friday. And so I'm going to ask them to invite each of you to their precinct. Now, some of you are in more than one precinct, and so you would pick, and I'll ask them to send it to all the at-large members, every council, every precinct commander. But I'd like you to see what they're doing each and every day to manage their neighborhoods, to not only combat crime, but to try to improve quality of life in all the neighborhoods. And if I don't get a chance to say it, I certainly appreciate this opportunity. You know, these sometimes we think of these as numbers on a page, and we get immune to it. But I know that there were a good many people at the Titans game on Sunday and a good many more that watch it on TV. But if at halftime they had brought out caskets, they had brought out 79 caskets, last year's homicide number, and placed them on the field. An average casket, a standard casket, is 86 inches long. So it would go from goal line to goal line and then 89 yards back. So that would be quite a visual impact. So that's how we should think about those, each and every one, as opposed to sometimes we get immune to just looking at the numbers. Thank you.
Councilman Mendez.
Thanks, Mr. Vice Mayor. Dr. Paul, several of my colleagues have talked about the relationship between poverty and gun death. I wanted to ask, some of those statistics and studies you referenced, I assume there are studies that tie poverty to gun deaths. Is that right?
We didn't look at it specifically ourselves, but yes, I think neighborhoods with concentrated poverty tend to have a higher rates of violence.
And then also tying together the other issue they've been talking about, which is race. I assume your office looks at the statistics showing that poverty in Nashville disproportionately impacts minority groups?
Disproportionately, yes. We didn't actually do the analysis for the gun deaths by race.
Well, my request would be that going forward, as your department talks about this, as the police department talks about it, if it's true that there's hard science that demonstrates that concentrations of poverty lead to more gun deaths, both suicide and homicide, and Nashville has got a disproportionate impact of poverty on minority groups, then I think it's important that we just lead with that as a thing. If you concentrate poverty, there will be more gun deaths, and there will be a disproportionate impact on race. And as far as a top-line goal, that's as good as any for us to focus on. So that's my request for you guys to consider as you make the presentation moving forward.
Sure, thank you.
Council Lady Dowell.
Thank you. I want to say thank you for all of you coming out and having this conversation today. I hope it's one of many that we'll continue to have over time. And I want to also thank you, Vice Mayor Briley, for setting this up. We've seen incidents happen all over this city, and it's unfortunate that it took, an incident happening in the core of our city to bring us here to this point to have this conversation. But I do believe our police department do a wonderful job, and our mayor has made a commitment to the city to address some of the youth issues that we see, not only in education, but also creating the job opportunities that Council Lady Gilmore, as well as Scott Davis, Councilman Scott Davis, spoke about. But one of the things, we always bring the police in and we ask them, what do we do, or what can you do? But I would like to bring it back to us, like what are some things that we can do? I know that I've heard some over 900 plus faith-based organizations in our community, and just in that southeast area, we have tons of schools. I notice many of them close at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and the churches are just open on the weekend. But I do want to hear your comments and thoughts about what kind of partnerships that we can have with some of the faith-based organizations and how we can support them in preventive measures for youth committing violent acts, as well as with the schools. I know we have a NASA program, but most of those are run out of our recreation centers. But we have a lot of nonprofits in this city, and they have the solutions. Stronger Than My Father is one of the organizations in our area that work with mentoring youth and give them a place to go after school. And I think what we've learned, if they have somewhere to go after school and engaged in activities, they're less inclined to be out on the streets committing crime. And if they're engaged in activities and have an adult role model, they're less inclined to commit acts of violence. So can you just speak toward what role we can have with our faith-based organizations as well as with our schools after hours to have facilities for our young people to go and to be engaged in activities? Thank you.
All good points. I think for a lot of the work that we do to try and improve community health together, it's often a challenge. It's both a great asset and a challenge that we have lots of different nonprofits, communities of faith, and bringing people together around a common goal, and actually having the discipline to keep lots of different organizations moving in the same direction to actually bring solutions to a scale that they have a real impact is one of the big challenges and one of the big exciting things that we can do. You know, the buzzword out there is collective impact. How do we together piece together communities of faith, nonprofits, government, business to have an impact on health and have an impact on safety for these kids?
You know, this goes on every day all across Nashville, and we have so many groups that you've mentioned. You know, we mentioned Pastor Stevenson, Pastor Harris over at Galilee, the Saturday morning study sessions with the children, inner city ministries with, you know, busing in kids, not only for the church services, but to help them with their homework. And actually they've installed washers and dryers there to help them, you know, washing their clothes and so forth. But we just need a lot more of what you and I are talking about to fill those gaps. They're not reaching everybody in Nashville.
There's several other questions, but I'm going to have to wrap us up here, just so everybody can move around for just a minute before we start the regular meeting. I wanted to thank the chief and Dr. Paul for coming. I want to make sure that everyone understands that their invitation was not in any way meant to minimize the hard work that they are already doing. We applaud you for that and thank you for that. It was meant to send the message that we as a Metro Council are here to help, and we await your requests for additional resources. It was also meant to send the message that we're ready to take action. As the chief mentioned, this is sometimes it seems like it's just numbers. I want to bring us back to earth with an email I got just a few minutes ago. It says, "I am sorry that I'm now learning about the public session today on gun violence in Nashville. Unfortunately, my wife is out of town, and I'm taking care of my 2 young children that I do not want to expose to the details of this hearing. My brother was murdered on Wednesday, September 26, 2016, at approximately 12:40 in broad daylight on Ed Temple Boulevard. He had left his job at the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development and was on his way home in the Nations neighborhood to walk his dog and eat lunch. Someone shot him dead and drove away on Buchanan Street in what the media is deeming a road rage incident. To my knowledge, there have been no leads in this case other than a fuzzy picture. It terrifies me to know that someone in this city can be killed randomly for no reason and seemingly no repercussions. I've lived here for 11 years. Both of my children have been born here, and my wife and I have been very active in this community. My brother was a wonderful person who had lived here for exactly 1 year. His life was just beginning. I appreciate you holding this session, and I'm very sad I cannot be there. Any help would be greatly appreciated, and likewise, if I can do anything to help with the cause, Nashville should be better than this." Thank you very much.